Good evening. Good evening. And welcome to Luther Seminary. We gather tonight and we acknowledge the sacred lands on which we live and learn. We remember that before the roads and sidewalks and bridges that brought us here today, that this land was an oak savanna, tended to by the Anishinaabe and Sioux people. We remind Indigenous people walked and lived on this sacred land, and they still do today. And so we remain mindful of broken covenant and the need to strive to make right with all our relations. If we haven't met, my name is Jenny Grandgard. I'm the seminary pastor here at Luther. I also serve on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Board here, which has sponsored this event tonight along with Student Council. We are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion here at Luther Seminary. And we have invited Drew Hart to be among us this day to advance this conversation and this work required of all of us in this place, in Christ Church, and in our country, for the sake of God's world. And we recognize the need to heal the wounds that sin has caused. And thank you, Drew, for being a part of that healing. Let us pray. You have called us, O God, to do justice, love mercy, and to move humbly with you. So often, O God, we move away from you and one another. Turn us ever again toward you and toward each other. Grant that we may do the work to be liberated from anti-Blackness and white supremacy. Open our hearts and our minds to hear the word that Drew embodies. Bless him in this work. Keep him in courage and safety. And let your spirit be as close to us as breath, that we may breathe and live anew your call to be a new creation. In the name of Jesus, amen. I welcome Alex Oman, Student Council President, forward.
Hello, as Pastor Jenny said, my name is Alex Oman. We, Student Council, along with the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, are sponsoring tonight's event. And it was with great pleasure and my privilege to introduce Drew Hart to you. He gave me the choice of reading either the short bio or the long bio. The long bio is really long, so we're going to stick with the short one tonight. So Dr. Drew Hart is a public theologian and professor of theology at Messiah College in Pennsylvania. He has 10 years of pastoral ministry experience and has worked for an after-school program in the city for middle school boys. In addition to teaching, he provides anti-racism and faith-based justice talks and workshops across the country and collaborates with local faith-rooted organizers, activists, and leaders in Harrisburg. His book, Trouble I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church Views Racism, utilizes everyday stories, Jesus-shaped lessons, and anti-racism frameworks to transform the church's understanding and social witness. Drew's writing can be found in Red Letter Christians, Sojourners, the Christian Century, and the Mennonite, among other places. And Dr. Hart speaks regularly at colleges, conferences, and churches. I think we can add seminaries to that now. Throughout North America. His newest book project is entitled Who Will Be a Witness? Igniting Activism for God's Justice, Love, and Deliverance, and it will be published in the fall of 2020. Dr. Drew Hart was the recipient of the BCM Peace's 2017 Peacemaker Award and was honored locally with the 2019 W.E.B. Du Bois Award in recognition of his commitment and work for justice locally and nationally. And most recently, he was chosen as Elizabethtown College's 2019 Peace Fellow. Drew and his family live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. So with that, will you please join me in welcoming Drew Hart to Luther Seminary.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to already be with you all and to get to know many of you through meals and conversations. And some of you do not know that this is actually my second time here. I had the privilege of, I think it was more for community. My voice is going in and out a little bit. I had the privilege of speaking to some community folks. I believe it was a series on finance, I believe. It was like a stewardship series. And they somehow figured a way to squeeze in the theme of race. And so they asked me to speak on white privilege, stewarding white privilege was the framework. And so I did this thing where I actually dismantled the idea that we can steward white privilege, was basically my idea. But I was grateful for the opportunity to be here already.
Sorry, you're cutting up too much.
Okay, we're going to swap real quick. Testing, can you hear me? All right. I want to thank Leon for the invitation to come, and for the student leaders and the board and faculty that have read the work, and the commitment to just continuing not only the conversation but the work of actual institutional transformation. It's really important, and I'm always pleased when I see that work actually unfolding within institutions and communities. And so I want to encourage you all to continue to keep pressing on and stay committed to that work. You know, I often get opportunities to come and speak at churches and different groups that have read my work. And on one particular occasion, I think it was about 3 years ago, I was invited to a church back in Pennsylvania that they were reading my work, and so they wanted to, as a Sunday school class, go through the book, and at the end of it, bring me in to speak. And so I came in and I gave my talk and engaged the Sunday school class, preached that Sunday morning to the greater congregation, and after that, the church decided that they wanted to figure out other ways that they could continue to kind of grow and be transformed and kind of bring folks along. And so they decided that they were going to send some of their folks on this civil rights bus tour that I had talked to them about. And so one of my colleagues, Todd Allen, who's now at Messiah College, he runs this 9-day bus tour. And so they said, all right, we're going to send folks on this bus tour. And so they did. They put money aside to send some folks on the bus tour. 9 days going through the South, all the hot spots through the civil rights movements, getting to meet folks who were actually involved in the movement in those different locations, hearing those firsthand stories, and just kind of getting immersed in that story and kind of relearning the history of our country in many ways. And so they did that, and in response to that, they decided that they were going to bring my colleague, Todd, to come and speak after that to the congregation. So they brought him in, and he was sitting in the front, getting ready to preach that Sunday morning to the same congregation I spoke to. And they had like, you know, if you can imagine churches that have a slideshow with all the different pictures of their experience of those who went on the trip, and music, sentimental music, you know, to get you caught up in it. And right after that ended, the lead pastor got up, and he was right about to invite Todd up, and all of a sudden, someone yelled out from the congregation, "Why can't we just get over it?" Of course, an awkward moment for my colleague, who then had to get up and speak with that in the atmosphere, right? And I kind of wonder, now I'm a troublemaker in my mind. I can't help myself. Sometimes I get a little bit in trouble. And so I like to replay and be like, what would I have done if somebody had yelled out right before I was about to speak, "Why can't we just get over it," right? So of course my, troublemaking mind, I kind of replay the moment. And so I imagine that I might go and want to dig deeper in this question around, can we get over it, right? So I might want to ask him, if we need to get over it, I don't want to assume anything about anybody's life. So I would want to ask him a series of questions like, are you from a family that has just been so committed to racial justice that now finally, after all this work that your family has been doing, you're ready to get over it, right? Maybe they've got generations, right, of folks. Maybe their great-great-great-great-grandfather was like an abolitionist, right? And maybe like his dad was a civil rights leader and marched with King and everything, right? And so he had lived this long life, this long tradition had existed way before him, where everybody before him prior had been working so hard towards anti-racism, and now he's like, all right, we put in enough work, it's time to get over it. Maybe everybody in his own community, right, all around him was surrounded with people who were just always committed to the work of racial justice, and so now, again, after all this work had been put in, it was time to wrap it up. He could wipe his hands clean and feel like the work had been done, time to get over it, right? And if that was the case, I could at least understand, but odds are, of course, that for most folks, they don't come from a tradition where they've been a part of a long tradition of anti-racism work where their folks were abolitionists and everyone was civil rights leaders and everyone was committed to anti-racism all around them. The odds are is that for most folks, most people come from traditions and communities where they've never been on it to begin with. And I know for that congregation, at least the lead pastors themselves were inviting me and my colleague there because they believed that they had not been on it, right? And so some of what I want us to begin to think about is what does it mean for us as the church to get on it for the first time, right? To get on it, to get on justice for the first time, to get on being truthful, telling a truthful narrative about who we've been as the church in the United States and in around the world, and to be honest about that, grapple with that for the first time. What does it mean to get on it for justice, for righteousness, for peace for the very first time? And hopefully we can begin to create the communities and the traditions that maybe one day we can truly say with some kind of meaningful substance that we have overcome and we can get over it, right? But we are far, far away from that reality today. Some of what I want to do this evening is, I was thinking about, as a seminary, a place that prepares leaders for ministry in church and society. What does it mean? What are some of the things that we need to be grappling with? And some of it was thinking about the ways in which Christianity has been entangled with white supremacy, thinking about the racist character of our society today, and then thinking about how the church can respond to these realities. And so that's what I want to do. When I love to tell stories about my time as a student at Messiah College, and I had 2 chapel experiences that I will never forget. In many ways, these 2 chapel experiences helped me to begin to understand how so many people have been socialized by a particular kind of Christianity. So I want to tell these chapels. The first one was, we had different kinds of chapels. The first one was a main chapel, and it was, I think, a year or 2 after 9/11. And we had invited a main speaker, and I, at the time, had not known who he was, but maybe some of you guys will know his name when I say it now. His name was John Deere. He was a Catholic priest, and he was our speaker that day. And so there we were in this big, large auditorium, a couple thousand people. John Deere's there, a couple years after 9/11, and he gets up front, and he begins to teach on Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And so he's teaching on the Sermon on the Mount and teaching about how Jesus taught to love your enemies and blessed are the peacemakers and turn the other cheek and all these ways in which the church ought to embody the love of God and the peace of God, right? Now, I didn't grow up in a peace church tradition. Messiah has some historic peace church background to it, but that's not why I went there. But I was intrigued by his message. He's basically just teaching the words of Jesus, right? Literally from the Sermon on the Mount. So there he is. He's teaching Jesus. He's teaching these Sermon on the Mount, and then he begins to connect it to and address the kind of nationalistic militarism of our moment, right? And he begins to talk about the spirit of revenge that was in the air and how, this idea of striking back and killing our enemies, how that had just so pervasively shaped the imagination of so much of the church at that historic moment. Now, again, I was like, oh, he's stepping on some toes. I mean, I could feel, he named George Bush, he named the military, everything, right? He was just kind of going there. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. Now, again, this was not my tradition. I wasn't used to maybe such a strong emphasis on peace and its implications, but I had grown up in a black church where they taught us to centralize Jesus, right? And so I knew, at the very least, I had to hear him out because it was literally the words of Jesus that he was emphasizing and fleshing out and trying to make connections from Jesus to our society today. And so he went on and on and on about that. And so right as he was doing that, I decided I was going to lean in and kind of take in and listen to what he really had to say. And as I was leaning in, I began to notice some rustling going on in the auditorium, some movement going on in the auditorium. And all of a sudden, I realized as I looked to the left and to the right, hundreds and hundreds of students are getting up and they are leaving, loudly leaving the auditorium like a stampede, right? They're just leaving, they're bouncing out as I'm leaning in. And so it was a really interesting moment for me. And I had to begin to wrestle with, why are they so angry? I mean, I get that he was stepping on toes. It was obvious, right, that he was stepping on toes. But why couldn't they just sit and listen to this very Jesus-centered message, literally focusing on the teachings of Jesus? Why at least not hear out what he had to say? Why would you bail out at that particular moment? I was confused. And after seeing that unfold and talking to my colleagues and friends at that time, I began to see that they were clinging to their American identity more than to their Christian identity, right? Their baptismal identity seemed to matter very little as it related to hearing a different message from a different Christian perspective that might challenge them and have them wrestle with who they are. And so I began wrestling with, why were my friends and my peers clinging to their American identity and not clinging to their Christian identity at these critical moments, right? Even if they agreed or disagreed, just to even sit and listen and to receive a challenging word. It was the second chapel. Now, we had, at Messiah at that time, we had something called culture shock. So we had these alternative, smaller chapels. Often, many of them were student-led, and so students of color on campus had a chapel called Culture Shock back then. And mostly black, but in terms of leadership, but all students of color, usually that was like the chapel that we went to, and certainly that was intentionally trying to minister contextually to the students of color on campus. And so this day went to Culture Shock like I normally did, and we had another speaker, and I actually don't remember his name, but it was a person a young African-American man who was there, and he began to speak, and he began basically with the kind of running through the biblical narrative, talking about this God that was revealed in the God of Exodus, who sided with those who were enslaved, right? And this God who, when even Israel, was mistreating folks from within, God sent prophets that challenged them to do justice, right? And so he kind of ran through the biblical narrative, and he talked about how it culminated in the person of Jesus Christ, this Messiah who said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He's anointed me to bring good news to the poor and release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And so he saw this full narrative of who God is, this God that's always been on the side of justice, always been on the side of the oppressed and the vulnerable and the poor. And then he compared it to the American history that has unfolded in this country, right? He talked about the slavery and genocide of indigenous people in this country and the forcible removal from their homelands. And he talked about the Jim Crow and all these systems of racial oppression that have shaped and have organized our society in so many different ways. And I was like, all right, now, I grew up in a black church where I had heard folks talk about race and justice before. That wasn't the first time that I had heard this. But nonetheless, the way that he was talking about it was a little more radical than what I had heard in my own church growing up. So I was like, oh, he's pushing. He's really stepping on toes again. But I was like, well, this is clearly a very Jesus-shaped message. This fulfills in the person of Jesus Christ. And he's really trying to help us, through all the mess that we've been in as a church in this country. And it was interesting. So as I began to lean in, I began to notice once again that some, not as many, but some students, some of the white students, there were not a lot in this particular chapel, but some of the white students that were there began to get up and they began to bounce and leave once again as he was talking. And it was interesting, and so I thought again, I was like, what is going on? Why is this happening? And I had to wrestle with the fact that it seemed, at least, that many of my peers were clinging to their white identity more than to their Christian identity. And at the moment that they had to make a choice between the two, the choice was their whiteness was going to win out in that moment. Those two chapels helped me grapple with the ways in which nationalistic Christianity has been so significant in our country, but also racialized Christianity has been so significant and has often been the discipler of people. That often that has been a more significant kind of formation in people's lives than Christian discipleship itself. And so I watched them cling to their American identity and their white identity. And it was those kinds of experiences, and many more, not only those, that forced me, honestly, to get into studying theology and Christian history, because I wanted to understand how in the world did Christianity get so entangled with white supremacy? Like, there's a story to be told. And I need to understand how this got to where it is today. And I really believe that we've got to grapple with the ways in which Christianity has been entangled. I mean, if you think if we give shorthand to Christian history, right? We see the growth and the birth of Christendom, right? Which we could just say is Christian supremacy over society, right? Society shaped by Christian supremacy. But what you see is that Christian supremacy morphs into white supremacy, right? That it's the church gives theological permission, right, to terra nullius, right, the papal bull. The church gives permission to go and enslave in Portugal, right, to colonize and to plunder, right. The church continues to give permission to enslave and to plunder people, bodies, resources, land. And so, in many ways, we can begin to see the ways in which Christianity has been entangled so deeply in white supremacy. And so, people went out all around the world. I mean, you think about the history of missions, and sometimes people would go and they say, we're going to give you Jesus. We're going to give you Jesus, right? All you got to do is cut your hair, change your clothes, speak the holy language, move in this way or that way. Your liturgy's got to be this way and that way. And then we see them come out. All things die, all things become new. And we say, whose image were they being fashioned after? And you can see the ways in which Christianity and Western civilizations have been so conflated with one another that people couldn't discern the one from the other. And we're living in the aftermath of that. We're living in that world where we still hardly can differentiate the one from the other. And where we have only begun to grapple with the whitened Jesus and the way that Jesus has been used and manipulated like a white supremacist mascot to uphold the status quo. and to bolster systems of social dominance. We've got to grapple with the ways in which Christianity has been entangled in white supremacy, not just on the surface level, but in deep, profound ways in our traditions themselves. After we've begun to grapple with that reality that Christianity has been entangled with white supremacy, and we see that in some ways the inertia of that is that it doesn't take a Christian society anymore for that white supremacy to go on and take on a life of its own, right? Then we've got to grapple with in what ways is white supremacy shaping our lives? In what ways, what is the racist character of our society today, right? In what ways, if we can't identify and name and see the ways that those things are embedded in our everyday lives, the ways that race organizes our life, then we are unable then to not only disentangle it from our faith, but then from our everyday lives as the church and society. Our entire society is organized by the ideology of racial hierarchy, right? Our entire society is organized by that. I often tell, and I know some of you guys already who've read the book know my story, I tell a story about a pastor who wanted to get together and meet with me because we were at the same seminary at the time, and so we just decided, sure, let's get together, let's chat, let's get to meet. And so he invited me and we went out. It was a summer day, hot summer day, and we met in McDonald's in the middle of the afternoon, and we got sweet teas, right? The sweet teas from McDonald's, the cheap $1 sweet teas, and if you're, I don't know out here how you guys do with a sweet tea, but if you really like true, real sweet tea, then it's just like sugar water, right? It's just nothing but sugar water. But it's so good. It's not good for you. You shouldn't drink it. Don't drink it. But I love it, all right? So I'm drinking the sugar water, the sweet tea, and it's good stuff when the straw just sticks straight up. It doesn't even move because it's so much sugar. Then you're drinking the sweet tea, right? Or I like to think, I know I'll drink the sweet tea and I think my dentist is having hot flashes somewhere off and he knows I've done something terribly wrong, right? So that's when you're having the sweet tea, when you're getting cavities at the same time and you're okay with it. So that's what we're doing. So we're drinking sweet teas and we're just swapping stories back and forth, getting to know each other. And so he told some of his story, told some of my story. We find, in some ways, what's interesting in these moments are the ways in which we see both our shared humanity at points and as well as our differences, right? And so that's really what happened at this moment. Just sharing the ways that we both had a lot of commonalities, things that maybe both of us might not have expected, and also ways in which we just were different, right? And so we're getting to know each other and sharing those stories. And suddenly my friend, he grabs one of these cups and he puts it in between us, and he gets really serious. He got this really serious look on his face. And he's like, Drew, you see this cup? He's like, you see, my side of the cup has a logo and your side has writing on the other side, and I can't see what's on your side of the cup and you can't see what's on my side of the cup. And he goes on, I need your eyes to see what's on your side of the cup, and you need my eyes to see what's on my side of the cup. And I was like, oh, we're having a nice Sunday school special moment here. This is really sweet. It was really genuine. It came from the heart. And so he's sharing, and after he's done, I'm like, that's nice, but it doesn't really work like that, right? And of course, he's thinking what in the world? How are you going to tell me? So I told him, I said, look, I already know what's on your side of the cup, right? A little bold, I know, it's a little bold. And so I told him, look, this is how I know. I've grown up, even in all black communities, going to majority black schools, and I still had majority white teachers. When I went to school, we still learned about Eurocentric history and literature and all of that, right? When I went off to college, my first year, I was the only African American on my floor at my Christian college in my dorm. The only African American on my floor. I had to learn how to navigate this space, the different music and culture and things. I had to interpret and try to make sense and navigate that world, right? At every level, I've had majority white teachers, right? In fact, even today, I teach in the classroom and it's majority white. I speak all the time. When I travel and I go out of my neighborhood, then it's majority white. I've always, at different stages in my life, had to navigate mostly white, majority white contexts. Different white cultures and stuff like that. I've had to learn, had to navigate and make sense, and often wondering and trying to interpret, how are people interpreting my black body? So I said to him, but I don't believe you've ever had to do those same things. You can go your whole entire life and not even think about what it means to submerge yourself in black community and cultures. In fact, he was an IVP author and all that stuff. I was like, look, you can go your whole life. You can never step foot in a black community and you can be successful. You cannot read black intellectual thought, black theology, black history, black art, trends, artistic trends, anything, right? He can be oblivious to all of that, and it's not going to harm his life at all. Why? Because these institutions in this society were structured and organized for his success, right? They were designed to advantage him regardless of that. So whether or not, even if he's chosen this limited way of life, right, lacking the beauty of God's diversity in his own life, it's not going to harm him in any way, at least as it relates to financially and what most Americans call success. And so when we think about this idea of our racialized society, we begin to wrestle with how our entire society is organized by the ideology of race. We have to recognize that sometimes in the church, we are given really simplistic answers to complex problems. 400 years of white supremacy in this land, 250 years of slavery and Jim Crow and educational apartheid and intentional, stripping of resources of black communities, black and brown communities. We could go on, mass incarceration, and health. We could go on and on and on. And what's our answer? Let's have a potluck or a pulpit swap. Then the walls of racism will come down, right? These are really simplistic answers to much more complex problems. And I'm not saying not to do potlucks or whatever. That's not my point. My point is that if we are really going to subvert white supremacy, it's going to take much more intentionality, strategy, and going much deeper to the roots of the problem rather than these surface things that are just pulpit swaps and these meet and greets that we'll do once a year on MLK Day or something. One of the challenges, but also opportunities I think that we have is when we begin to be clear about what exactly we mean when we use the word racist. What exactly do we mean? What are we talking about, right? And my experience has been that oftentimes there are different definitions floating around at the same time, and people are kind of talking past each other. You have these moments where you're using the same words, but you mean completely different things. I think that happens so often when it comes to racism. And so what I've seen is that there's what I call a thin definition and a thick definition of racism. And it's really important for us to be clear about what exactly we mean when we say racism, to make sure that we're talking about the same thing. Oftentimes, what I call the thin definition is when people talk about racism as personal prejudice or hatred towards one person towards another, right? And so they're thinking about, oftentimes in people's minds, they're thinking about like the KKK and the skinheads and stuff like that, and people that overtly communicate personal prejudice or hatred because of the color of someone's skin or their parents, the phenotypes of somebody, right? And oftentimes, people will say, well, if you look in the dictionary, that's the definition you're going to find, right? Racial hatred or prejudice from one person to another. And of course, I say, oftentimes that's usually like the first definition in the English dictionary, right? Is some kind of like narrow definition like that. But I often say, like, the dictionary is not perfect. It's more of a reflection of how we use language more than it is necessarily always the most descriptive and most helpful way. Another example would be my generation, thanks to us, we've added, selfie and Google is now a verb, right? All these things. It's because that's the reflection of how we use, not necessarily the most sophisticated definitions, it's just a reflection of how we use the language. But if you were to go and leave the first definition from an English dictionary alone, and you would go to a sociology department, or maybe open up a critical race theory book, they're not going to give you such a narrow, thin definition. They're going to give you a much thicker sociological definition that takes into consideration the history of its development and the patterns that exist throughout society, and the ways that our actual society is organized by race itself, right? And so it's a very different way of getting at racism, not thinking about it in terms of personal prejudice, something that nobody can really prove how somebody else is feeling or viewing. I mean, it's just it's pointless game of trying to decide what somebody else's feelings are, right? That in some ways doesn't even really matter. But what we can look to are institutions and policies and practices and patterns that are all across our society that shape and define and limit people's lived experiences and opportunities and social relationships, right? And so in what ways are we going to grapple with the thicker definition of racism that actually helps us see and understand what's going on around us, rather than just pretending to peer into the soul of somebody else, which we can never do. Only God and them can grapple with that. When we think about racism, and particularly moving away from just racism in the abstract to thinking about how racism actually has unfolded in the real world, right, on the concrete grassroots level, then we have to grapple with the particular, we could say, DNA of racism as it has worked in the real world, right? So in the general, you would say, racism is about organizing society by race. But in the real world, we have to say it's not just race in general, but it was the idea of racial hierarchy, right? A particular racial hierarchy in which whiteness was deemed as superior and over better, more beautiful, good, right, pure, everything, right, in the world in that particular way. And so one of the ways I think about that is thinking about the Clarke doll experiment. So if you've read, and maybe in school, psychology class, you learn about the Clarke doll experiments. And so you have these, in the 1940s, this experiment done with children, right? One child at a time would have a white doll and a black doll in front of them, and they're asked a series of questions. Which doll is the good doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the ugly doll, right? And nobody really was surprised by how the white children responded in the 1940s to these questions, right? Everything white was good, everything black was bad, right? So it wasn't necessarily surprised that in the 1940s, that's how these white children responded. The reason why people still talk about that experiment was more in response to how the black children responded, right? The great fear today is supposedly what they call reverse racism, right? That's the great fear. But when they took these children and they asked them these questions, what they found was they asked the same question: which doll is the good doll? Which doll is the bad doll? And so often, many of these black children pointed to the white doll as the good doll and the black doll as the bad one. Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the ugly doll? Again, so often these black children pointed to the white doll as the pretty one and the black doll as the ugly one. And what they began to realize is that it's not reverse racism, it's internalized racism, that all these children are just human beings, all of them. and they're all living in a society permeated with white supremacist ideas and imagery all around them, and they were all in various levels and degrees susceptible to internalizing these ideas, these harmful ideas. And so that they weren't reversing the racist system, right? The ideology wasn't flipped on its head. That these children, while maybe to a lesser degree than the white children, were still nonetheless internalizing these really harmful ideologies. And what was saddest was when they would ask the question, and which doll looks most like you? And then after they've just given all these negative attributes to the black doll, then they point to this black doll as the one that they identified with the most. They had internalized, and it shaped how they saw themselves and their own community, right? It's dangerous to think about this idea of racial hierarchy and the way that we are all socialized to see. I mean, sometimes we miss the optics of race, right? That it's a way of seeing and it's a way of being seen in the world. And that everyone thinks that they're just objectively seeing the world, but we don't grapple with the ways that we've been socialized, that there's a filter that's shaping our interpretations of others. And a filter that shapes how people interpret our own bodies. We as the church have to grapple with racial hierarchy, with white supremacy, with anti-blackness, with the ways in which we are socialized to see human beings through a particular script, a narrative that we think we know something about them immediately upon seeing someone, right? That's what race is not just it has really little to do with the physical. It's really, it's making a social statement. It's a socio-political redefinition of human beings around us. It's often very hard for white folks to grapple with their whiteness. I mean, I remember when I was in college particularly, I remember some white folks saying, "Oh man, I wish I had a culture. So boring. It would be so cool if I had a culture." And I'm there from Philly in central Pennsylvania. I'm like, trust me, you got a culture. I see it. But this experience, this way of seeing themselves as the norm, I mean, it's a power move. Let's not be confused. Whether it's done intentionally or not, it's a power move to make oneself the norm, the universal, right? And then everyone else is different. It's like you go to the ethnic aisle in the grocery store. What's that about, right? Think about this now. This is ethnic aisle. So you're telling me there's one aisle is where all the ethnicity and culture is happening. Nowhere else, just this one aisle. You're gonna tell me that Hot Pockets aren't a culturally particular reality? Come on now, right? But there's a way of construing and categorizing the world to make everything else normal. And this is the particular. This is where the difference is happening. This is where the ethnicity is happening. That's the excitement, right? That's why people all the time, we can't really grapple with race in our church because we have an all-white church and an all-white community. I'm like, you're in the center of the action. That's where it's all happening. You're right in the center of it all. You need to be grappling with it more than anybody else. But they imagine that it's neutral space somehow now as it relates to race. They can't see their own whiteness, their own formation, their own socialization. And so it's really important for white people to grapple and wrestle with, what does it mean to be white? I often ask people, do you know the story of how Europeans became white? That's the story right there. Every white person should be in the library, searching, hunting, trying to understand how that story unfolds. How did Europeans become white? Why did Europeans become white? If you can't answer that question, then you haven't grappled with the significance of whiteness and what it means to be white in the world. We've got to know our own stories. Honest tellings of our stories, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I often tell congregations, and this deeply influenced from Willie James Jennings' work, you got to grapple with race and place. You got to grapple with what's the story of your own community? Who were the indigenous folks who lived on the land? How and when and why were they displaced? What laws and policies and customs were created that allowed people or discouraged people from coming, right? There's a reason why I keep getting told that this is a 96% white area, right? There's a reason. These things don't happen accidentally. There's always a story. What's the story? Where were people invited and where were people not? Where was their hostility? Where was their redlining and restricted deeds, right? Where's the railroad tracks? Every city's got the railroad tracks. What highways went through your community, right? How were the lines of resources contoured geographically? We've got to grapple with race and place, and the church ought to be the place where we can tell a truthful story about what has gone on in this land, in these places. When I lived in Harrisburg, so I lived in a neighborhood called Allison Hill, and Allison Hill was a neighborhood that at one time, supposedly, was an all-white community. It's not that anymore. White flight happened. Most white people are gone. There's just a few remnants of the fact that white people used to live there, because there's like a few poor white folks who I think couldn't leave with the white flight movement, right? And so they kind of got left behind. But other than that, it's a very poor black and brown community. They say South Allison Hill is the poorest neighborhood between Philly and Pittsburgh. And so there in this neighborhood, I was a youth pastor and worked for an after-school program for middle school boys. And this one particular day, I hopped into it was my first car, my 92 Mercury Sable. That was my first car, paint all faded and stuff, but I love that thing so much. So I hopped into my little hoopty there, and I was driving through Market Street, going through the heart of Allison Hill, and literally, like, this is a very black and brown part of town. I mean, there's just not very many white people that you're going to run into. And this particular day, I'm driving, and all of a sudden, there's a buttload of white people just all over in this one corner, concentrated and gathered together. And so I'm like, what in the world is going on? Why are there so many white people out today? And so I'm driving, and I see all these white people, and they've all got these like bright yellow t-shirts on, right? So they're like kind of glowing. They want to be seen, and they're being seen, right? So I'm like, okay, this is interesting. Probably like some youth group or something doing some project, that kind of service work, right? So I'm getting closer, and I'm looking, but I'm like, but they look a little older. They look like adults. So I'm like, what is going on? What's happening here? And so I'm getting closer, and I see what they're doing. They got this big flatbed truck, and there's like groceries. So they're just like handing out groceries. People are walking down the street, they're just handing out groceries to everybody. It's like, Oprah, you get groceries, you get groceries. Everybody gets groceries, right? It didn't seem like it was organized. It just seemed like they were just giving it as people were walking down the street. If I wasn't running late, I probably would have pulled over, got my free groceries, but I had to be at a meeting, and so I had to keep going. And so I'm thinking like, oh, silly white folk, this is so typical, a little drive-by ministry, funny. So I get a little closer, and then all of a sudden I see what's on the t-shirt, and it says, Harrisburg Invasion. And then things ain't funny anymore. Harrisburg Invasion. This group had decided that they were going to come into our community, and they labeled their event Harrisburg Invasion. Now, I've been around enough white people to know that there's like a superiority complex that some folks have, but usually it's not the motto of the event. The paradigm, literally, they're going to come in and they're going to invade our community and help us poor, helpless little black and brown folk who are just waiting around for white people to do their 24-hour drive-by ministry, give out some groceries, and then disappear again. That's the paradigm. So now I was like, all right, Drew, am I being too hard on these folks? Maybe I'm being too hard. I had to think through this a little bit, right? I mean, these folks probably had really good intent, right? They probably had really good rationale. They wanted to help. I mean, think about it. Look, this is not 1850, not coming in here enslaving black folk. It's not 1925, they're not setting up Jim Crow systems. They're handing out groceries. Drew, am I being a little too hard? But then I thought about it, I was like, but see, the difference is, the problem is that in all of these changes, there's no question for me, in my mind, that they wanted to do good, that they wanted to be helpful. I have no question about that. But in the midst of all of these changes that we've gone in our society, white supremacy still remains intact. There is still a hierarchy. They had everything to give and nothing to receive from anybody else. And I think about the missed opportunities, right? I mean, what could have happened? They could have reached out to the leaders in our community that have been working, grinding in their own neighborhoods for decades. They could have called up and said, what can we want to give out groceries. And they might have said, you can keep your groceries, but maybe we need somebody to teach computer class, or we need somebody to mentor these kids, or to fix bicycles, or who knows, whatever they would have said, right? Who knows? But all I know is that they could have came and submitted to the already existing leadership in the neighborhood, right? Saw themselves not as teachers, but as students to learn. The paradigm could have been flipped upside down. So many missed opportunities. And so this white supremacy, even in the midst of service and good intentions, still remains in place. And I believe that it's often hard for white people to even imagine themselves as needing to become students, to needing black and brown mentors, that they might be the ones who need to be transformed by others. So many missed opportunities. So I think about, when we think about the history of this entangled, Christianity entangled with white supremacy, and we think about the racist character of our society and how it shapes all areas of our lives. I mean, we could literally go on and talk about education and healthcare and jobs and livable wages, and we could go on and on about all the different ways in which this fleshes out, right? How should the church respond? How should the church respond? One of the simple things I think is, I mean, it's kind of generic, but what does it mean to actually be the church? What does it mean? What does it mean to be the church? And what I'm thinking about in particular in this case is, what does it mean to find our belonging in Christ rather than in white supremacy? If you were to come over to my house as a guest, I'm going to immediately say, make yourself at home, right? Make yourself at home. I say it all the time, right? And when I say make yourself at home, this is what I mean. I mean, you can come in, kick your feet off, get comfortable, feel free to go into the fridge, grab a drink. You don't even have to ask. Just go ahead. Just make yourself, get comfortable, right? I don't want people all uptight in my house, right? I don't want you like this. I want you to make yourself at home, right? Get comfortable. But the truth of the matter is, when I say make yourself at home, I don't really mean make yourself at home, right? There's some things I don't want you to do. So if you come into my house and I say make yourself at home, and then you begin to take down my family pictures and put yours up, that's out of bounds, right? if you go upstairs and get my robe on, right, that's out of bounds, right? There's certain things I mean. I don't want you to rearrange my furniture in my living room. Those are things that I don't want you to do when I say make yourself at home. So in reality, when I say make yourself at home, I don't actually mean those words, make yourself at home, right? I just want you to be comfortable. Get comfortable. That's what I really mean, right? Now, I'm married. Renee, my wife, she has full belonging in our house. She has full belonging in our house. And so she, everything is up for change. If she can, in fact, there are times when literally the pictures are changed when I come back and there's a new picture up, right? Things can change because she belongs there fully, right? We've often talked about, she moved furniture, this and that. Those kind of things can often change. In fact, one of her favorite shirts and sweatshirts are my clothes, right? I try to tell her they're off limits. She doesn't even listen to me. But she really believes in this full belonging, right? And so all of those things are hers. But there's a deeper level to thinking about making yourself at home, right? I mean, if you think about it, we also got 3 kids. We got a growing family. And so what works for 2 doesn't always work for 5, right? So now all of a sudden, sometimes Renee's like, we only got 1 bathroom in this place, and it's going to only get worse as these kids get older, right? Maybe we need to build and restructure the house so that we can build another bathroom so that it can facilitate more people in this house, right? In fact, she's talking about what would it look like to knock this whole wall out for a more open space or this or that, or maybe we can finish the basement and all these different things. She's got ideas, right? But here's the thing, because of our growing family, everything is on the table. We are open to the restructuring anything and everything so that it can work for everyone that belongs in the house. So often, whether it be in churches or in institutions, people say, everybody says they're welcoming. I haven't met a church that won't tell you how welcoming they are. But they're like me. They really want people just to be guests. You can come in, you can do a little this or that, but don't mess with anything. We ain't changing the images of Jesus for you. Let's not get crazy now. We're not changing how we live and do life, our liturgy. And we certainly aren't going to radically restructure the very organization of our community life together. That's off the table. You've got to just assimilate in to the existing structures that are in place. And until we're willing to radically restructure everything for the sake of belonging in Christ, then we're just playing around, saying welcoming on one hand, and not really affirming and creating a new belonging in Christ on the other. I think that another way in which we've got to grapple as the church is in our capacity to tell the truth in our moment about what's going on. We're in a time where there's a lot of unease about shifts and changes happening in our society. Things are not the way they used to be. Things are changing. And some people feel uneasy and uncomfortable with the change. And I think of it like this. Imagine we were in a room, and we would gather weekly in a room, and every time we gather around this big table, and everyone's sitting around the table except for me. I like to stand on the table, right? So I get up on the table. I stand in the center of the table every time we meet, and that's just how we meet. And that's what we do week after week. We gather, everyone sits around the table except for me. I stand on the center of the table. And that's just the way it always is, right? And then imagine one day, TC is like, yo, Drew, why don't you get off the table and join the rest of us sitting around the table? Now, the fact of the matter is, this is the way we've always done it. Why are you picking on me, TC? Why are you targeting me? I don't like being focused in the target of this, right? And so probably what I'm going to say is, stop marginalizing me. Why do you want to marginalize me? Everything was fine. This doesn't feel good to be marginalized. But at that particular moment, someone needs to speak up and say, Drew, what we're asking you to do is not marginalization. Decentralization is not the same thing as marginalization, right? And we've got to tell a more truthful story as the church about what's going on. And it doesn't mean that we have to dismiss feelings. People are feeling disorientation. I have no problem with admitting and acknowledging that people are feeling disorientation because things are changing in our society. But how do we tell a truthful story about what's actually happening and invite people towards the fact that we are all equal, made as children, made in the image of God, right? And that's the vision. And we have to provide a clear vision of where we're going, this beloved community that we're working towards. And so that's some of the work that we've got to do as the church, is tell a more truthful story about the moment that we're in, differentiating marginalization from decentralization in the process. And then finally, I believe that we've got to get to work struggling, what I would say is through strategic grassroots action, embodying the way of Jesus on the ground, right? That we've got to get to work. We got work to do. Church, we got work to do. You know that in 1963, when Dr. King and the SCLC went to Birmingham, Alabama, at one particular point, things were looking really bleak. And there's this moment that a lot of people don't often hear the story, this time where they're sitting in the hotel room together, grappling with what to do because people are not showing up, right? People are not willing to get arrested like they thought they would. Funds are getting depleted. And who wants to go and get arrested in the Birmingham jail when you don't have funds to bail you out, right? And so people are wrestling with what to do. And worst of all, Passover weekend was literally right around the corner. And so they've got Passover weekend and Easter coming up, and what are they going to do? And so they're in this room, Dr. King with a bunch of his crew, and they're debating and dialoguing around what to do next. And so some people, Dr. King's got to go out. He's got to fundraise. Nobody can fundraise. They're going to respond to Dr. King and nobody else like him. And so we got to get him out there raising more money so that we can kind of reboot this thing, right? Others are saying, look, man, Easter weekend, most of them were pastors. I got to be in my home church, right? This is the biggest weekend in the Christian year calendar, right? We've got to be back in our churches. We can't be anywhere else. That's the most important thing. Some folks are saying, no, we've got to go hard, right? We got to keep going because the faithfulness calls us to enter into this moment right as it is. And even Daddy King was there, and he's like, come back to Atlanta, right? You don't need to be messing around with all this stuff. They're not messing around down here, right? And the whole time that they're debating and they're arguing, Dr. King is just kind of sitting back quietly. He's not saying anything at all. He's just quiet, listening to them as they're kind of saying their different things. And so they're arguing, and then all of a sudden, Dr. King just gets up. There's kind of like in the living room area of a hotel. He gets up, and he leaves and goes into the bedroom and closes the door. And it's like, okay. Didn't say anything at all. And so I guess argument about what needs to be done keeps going on. And a few minutes later, the door opens back up. But now Dr. King has changed his clothes. You know, you usually see him in like the black suit, kind of clean looking, kind of classic, right? Well, he went in like that, but he came out, changed his clothes, and now he was wearing blue work shirt, blue jeans. And the moment he came out, everybody knew exactly what that meant, right? That they were going to get to work and that they were going to get arrested over Passover weekend, right? And for Dr. King, what was important wasn't just celebrating the holiday, it was literally embodying the story of Jesus and sharing in that experience through his own life. And so those blue jeans signified getting to work and entering into the story, doing the work that's necessary, right? And so there is that famous picture, if you've ever seen it, of Dr. King and Shuttlesworth and Abernathy in the blue work shirts and blue jeans right as they're marching up, and then they get arrested, and Dr. King goes to jail and writes his famous letter to Birmingham jail, right? Letter from Birmingham jail. And so there is an opportunity for us to think about what does it mean for us to embody the story and to put on our own blue jeans and get to work, right? But I think one of the greatest challenges that we have in doing this work is that we're missing something very basic to Christian discipleship, and that's the ability to love, all right? We're missing this is Christianity 101, the very starting points. Love your neighbor as yourself. I learned this, I was devastated this past fall. I shared this story already with some others already. I was teaching a course called the Politics of Blackness. I get to teach, beyond my theology classes, I teach some first-year seminar stuff as well. And so I was teaching this course that's basically Black history, intellectual thought, and stuff like that, just gaining opportunity for people to think about Black lived experience and political struggle and different things. All right. So we read this one book called The Color of Money, which looks at basically the economic apartheid of our economic system and how that has impacted Black communities, that we've been left out, intentionally left out, right, out of the New Deal and all these other things, so that basically you see the government handouts to white folks in the mid-20th century in the ways that Black people were intentionally written out of being included in these policies that would have deeply impacted them, right, giving them access to housing and loans and such. And so we read the story, read the history of it, and my students, I mean, they understood the argument. They understood they could, through their own work, re-articulate how the history unfolded. And then we watched a documentary called Banished, and looked at how Black people in the early 20th century were forced off, in some places, forced off of land and banished from whole entire Black communities, banished basically from communities, and how there's now these current families who are the descendants of those folks looking and saying, are there any rights that we have to these lands? There was no deeds being passed on, so what's the implications of it, right? It's just grappling with the complexities of the past and how it shapes our current world. And after we had done all of that, my students, I had a few white male students who their first response to learning this history was, oh, this doesn't seem fair for white people. It wouldn't be fair to take land from white people. You don't want to repeat what was already done. And I was so deeply discouraged because I knew they understood the history, but their first concern was white people. After all that they understood had just happened, they just rehearsed the history of what happened to Black people, and their initial and just socialized response was, what about white people? They didn't know how to love Black people. They didn't care about the well-being of Black people. And I think that if we are going to be the church, especially when we think about the pervasiveness of anti-Black racism, we've got to learn how to care about the well-being of Black people and all non-white people. But in this case particularly, I'm talking about there's a way in which white people are taught not to care about the well-being of Black people. Love your neighbor as yourself. So I really believe that there's this love gap that we've got to tackle, we've got to address in our churches. Discipling people to love Black people and all people as they love themselves. then I believe that we're ready to get out and do the work. And so my, closing, so I know I'm not Lutheran. I grew up more like the Black Baptist world, right? So my closing invitation, I'm not gonna have you close your eyes or anything, no hands in the air, but my closing invitation is an invitation for us all to put on our blue jeans, right? Let's put on our blue jeans. Let's put them on for justice, put on our blue jeans for righteousness, put on our blue jeans for peace. Let's put on our blue jeans for those who are locked up, incarcerated right now, the millions, right? Those locked up in detention centers. Let's put on our blue jeans for those who don't have adequate health care or livable wages or jobs, right? Let's put on our blue jeans for those in underfunded education systems, right? In ghettos and neighborhoods that have been intentionally under-resourced and stripped from opportunities, right? Let's put on our blue jeans and bear witness to the Jesus that we claim, right? As followers of Jesus. Thank you.
Well, I think Drew's agreed to stick around for some questions now, so if you have any questions for him, I invite you to come up to the microphone here. I think Tom will moderate our question and answer session. And for those of you online, I'll post this in the chat too, but I'll be monitoring the chat there, so if you have any questions, we'll bring those up too. Thanks.
Yeah, so I was asked to moderate. Hi, I'm Tom Gehring, that's my name. I was asked to help moderate this question section. Drew, do you want a chair up here? You've been standing for a while.
No, I'm good.
Okay, cool. Basically, just a word about question and answer forums that I've noticed. If you are feeling unsettled or raw emotions at the moment, I invite you into dwelling with those emotions instead of asking a question out of those emotions. Because so often what happens is that when someone comes up to a question microphone, they end up giving a statement and not asking a question. So be aware, be intentional about the questions that you're asking. We have an expert in the field with us who has a lot that we can learn from. So if you have questions, I invite you to come forward to the mic here in the center.
Is this on? Great. Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Leif, MA student here. And my question is, so in this institution, a lot of white people, including myself, like to talk about the Swedish and Norwegian and Danish and Finnish and German histories that a lot of us have. And my question is, what do those stories and cultural backgrounds do you see as having a role in dismantling white supremacy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tricky question, and it's precisely because when you get to talking about the particularities of European identity, it can be used in two different ways. One way can actually be, I think, a way of just telling one's story, of being honest about one's own narrative. But there's also a way in which it can be used to skirt owning white supremacy, and can actually make white supremacy invisible again, right? And so I think that there's different ways that can play out. So I think it's really important, again, I already mentioned, and I think this is true, everyone's got to grapple with the history of how Europeans became white. And that means, it's gonna be a lot of different kind of stories. It's gonna be a lot of different stories. There's no one homogeneous story of how Europeans became white, right? Even in terms of just how white supremacy looks in different countries, right? is different, right? So white supremacy in the United States was centered in Protestant Anglo-Saxon identity, right? And so that was, in this land, when other European groups wanted to become white, they were assimilating into that, right, towards that. And so there's a lot of different kind of stories. So the stories, you read Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and stuff and hear how they talk about different European groups who they don't think are properly white, right? It's not pretty, right? Germans, oh no, not properly white, right? The Irish and Italians and all that. I mean, what do you call them? Swarthy complexion is the way I think Benjamin Franklin complained about them. And he goes on about how he wishes that the true white people, Anglo-Saxons, and a few principal folks from Germany, right? Germany and England basically make up the true body of white people in the world, and how he wished those numbers would increase in this land, right? So he doesn't have a very pretty image overall of most what we would call white people now, Europeans. And so there was this Anglo-Saxon chauvinism in which people were assimilating into, but that looks very different, and even in this land in terms of the different experiences that people had, because some people were experiencing marginalization in different ways themselves, right? And were trying to sometimes, in actually trying to avoid some of that, sometimes embraced white supremacy in even more pronounced ways than even Anglo-Saxon Protestants did, right? And so there's a whole bunch of stories to be untold, and I think it's really important to grapple with that and to reclaim one's own stories, not as just universal people, but as particular people. But I do think also at the same time, there's a way in which people can disown, really quickly dislodge themselves from whiteness because there's I'm Italian or I'm Irish, so this story doesn't apply to me, right? When in reality, it very much does. Being Irish or Italian doesn't absolve someone from the white supremacist narratives and the ways of assimilation. There's actually really horrifying stories of the ways that sometimes some of these communities perpetuated anti-black racism in local neighborhoods, right? And so as a strategy to try to fit in and assimilate. And so there's ways in which we've got to grapple with the complexities of it, not in a way that ignores or dodges, skirts, right? One's own community's relationship to white supremacy, but one that grapples with those stories in really honest ways. And again, it's going to be complex stories, a wide range, because there's not just one single story as it relates to how Europeans became white.
Hey. So I have two questions.
Yeah.
The first one is you talked about, first of all, you talked a lot about how white people in particular need to put our bodies on the line and take risks and do the work. Or maybe you didn't talk about that explicitly and I added that in my mind. But I do think that that's true, but you did also talk about following the leadership of black people who are already doing the work. And so my first question is, how can white people get on the front line to create a buffer when that's necessary without usurping leadership and invading? And then my second question, you had mentioned before you even started that you'd been here before, and you were talking about privilege not being something that can be responsibly stewarded.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could talk more about that.
Yeah, that's great. And maybe I'll start with that, and maybe it semi connects to the first question. So one thing that, if you've read my book, one thing you're going to notice is that I don't even use the language of white privilege in my book at all, right? And it's not because, now there was just recently, which I do not co-sign at all in any form, but there was recently a black pastor that wrote something negative about white privilege. I think all his reasoning was terrible. And basically it was because he was centering white people's feelings is the reason why he doesn't like white privilege, it seemed. But anyway, but I don't like the language of white privilege because I think it's vague language. It gets used in a lot of different ways. It's inconsistently used, and it doesn't help people move from where they are to somewhere else. It's often these passive thing. It's just this individualistic passive thing. You have white privilege. And then what I've seen is, liberal white people sitting around crying and feeling bad about themselves and thinking like that's the work now because I just have it, right? I have this white privilege and I've got to feel guilty and bad about myself, right? And that's not constructive for anybody, right? That's not doing the work. The work isn't you feeling bad about being European or white or whatever. That's not the work. I'm not saying that I think a part of the stage of the process is grappling with the significance of what has gone on, which I'm sure may include guilt and all these other things, but that's not the work. That's just a process that people got to go through. So one of the paradigms, I'll give an example. So there's a video I watched online once, and there was a black Christian leader, conservative Christian leader, and he was before a mostly white audience, and he was talking about stewarding your white privilege, right? And he's talking about, oh, you got to steward your white privilege, and he gives this story. His example is his friends. He had some friends who they went to Africa. He didn't even say where. Somewhere in Africa they went, and they went into a room and there's some nonprofit and things were just not right. So when they entered in the room, all the Africans, responded to them because they were white. And so they were able to fix things because, their white privilege that they had. And so he used that as a positive example of stewarding your white privilege, right? And I was like, wait a minute, this is terrible, right? And so basically the paradigm is that, so we've got centuries of white supremacy, right, that have been used for oppression and slavery and injustice and all that. And now the answer to, centuries of white supremacy is using that same white supremacy for good, right? That's supposedly the paradigm. And in all of that, racial hierarchy still remains in place, right? He's not concerned that people are responding more to them because they're white. He just thinks that because they're able to get something done, that's a good thing, right? And I think there's a danger in the paradigm of stewarding white privilege that you can easily get to that point where you think that's the role and responsibility, right? To use the control and power that I have for good without subverting it. So the paradigm that I've been sharing, the short of it, I haven't written on this yet, but verbalizing it, what I've argued is I'm learning from enslaved Africans who were taught that Jesus was white. And it's interesting, I was a little discouraged at first when I found out that there were some enslaved Africans that articulated and talked about a white Jesus. I was like, wow, I thought they would have, I got this really romantic idea of what, these enslaved Africans did, because they were in some ways reworking their faith. So, but you look closer and you begin to realize that oftentimes they talked about a little white man, right? Jesus is a little white man. And so you begin to realize that they're playing with these African trickster kind of paradigms, right? You think about in African American tradition, Briar Rabbit stories, right? These smaller figures that outwits these greater opponents, right? They're talking about Jesus as this little white man who's able to move and navigate, the plantation and the cabins and stuff like that. So he can pass, but he's really working on behalf of the enslaved people there. And I thought, there's something actually really intriguing about this paradigm, precisely because it owns the whiteness, that you can't control how other people see you, right? It's not just about your own social performance, it's also about how people see you and identify you. And so you may just get advantages just by matter of fact, regardless of what you're doing. But at the same time, there's this paradigm that's always trying to subvert and overcome these systems, right? That the goal is to subvert the white supremacy itself, not to utilize it for good, right? And so you can wrestle with the tension of both of those realities, right? What does it mean to inhabit a white body and also to be subverting those systems and policies and structures at the same time? So anyway, I don't know, I haven't written on it, maybe I'll flesh it out a little bit more, but that's a different direction, I think, than stewarding white privilege that I've been thinking about. The first question,
how to
oh, right. Yeah, I think it's that simple. There are plenty, and that's the thing, white people need good role models. There are white people that have entered in to other communities and have submitted to the existing leadership and are invited into full participation, right? There are models, there are people who've done this before. This is not, but people don't, there's no tradition of that being passed on in communities often, right? And so those stories are sometimes isolated and not lifted up. But I think it's important that there are ways in which, I mean, my experience, I often tell, so I teach an African American theology class every fall at Messiah College, and majority white students in this class, right? And so one of the things I do, just because I'm like, all right, they're gonna have to go visit some black churches, just because I'm gonna make them, right? And so they gotta visit a Black Baptist, an AME, Church of God in Christ, like, I mean, they gotta get a few different experiences and stuff, and they're always nervous, right? And I always tell them, look, what's gonna happen is you're gonna go in there and you're gonna be loved on more than you've ever been loved on in your life, right? That's what's gonna happen. And they're all nervous, and then they go, and then they talk, oh my goodness, I was so welcome there. My home church doesn't treat me like that. I got so many hugs and kisses, right, blah, blah, blah. And mother so-and-so said blah, blah. And it's just the whole thing, all right? And black communities, if they've erred, especially black churches, they haven't erred on being excluding. They've been very inclusive. It's just that white people have never opted into participating in those communities, right? And so the fact of the matter is that it's hard to fathom that if you are in solidarity, living in solidarity genuinely, you're going to be invited into all different kind of capacities. In fact, you might have to check and say, you might be inviting me a little too quickly into things, right? You got to check yourself maybe. But the fact of the matter is that there are, and so I invite white people to submit to black leadership, submit to black and brown leadership, and seek that as one of your paths towards your own transformation, your own liberation, as a part of that, right? And then in the midst of that, wait to be invited into the work, right? And it's usually there. And so if you show up, if you go to faith-based organizing events and stuff like that, and you show up, don't try to take over, but be available to work, however you're asked to work, right? And just be ready and available to put your body on the line if needed, however you're asked, right? And I think that is the real starting point for that kind of work. And so it's really important. And I think, I won't lie, like, I don't envy, like, the complexities of what it means to live out being white. Like, I don't, in terms of resisting our society, it's complex, it's messy, it's not easy answers, because there is no just stop being white in the sense of how people perceive you. You still have your body, and it will always be that, and you have to, I have a white colleague, Janelle Paris, who said, she's an example of a cat peeing on wood in the house, and it's stained, and it just stinks, and you can't get rid of the smell, right? And you have to live with that, right? And she uses that as her own way of talking about whiteness, of living with the stink of that's just a part of the work, right? That you can't escape that completely. You can live into new ways of being and relationships, but you still have to grapple with what does it mean to be white in a white supremacist society, that even if you are embodying something different, people will see you in a particular way, right? And have expectations of you, even if you are in disobedience to white supremacy in terms of how you live your life. Hopefully that's helpful.
Hi, Pastor. I was greatly moved by your lecture. My name is Carol. I just completed my first year here at Luther. I'm a freshman seminarian. I'm interested professionally in social justice. I have a big heart for God and community. It is said here in Minnesota that we have the largest gaps in the country in terms of education, housing, and employment. And this is something that I'm sure the people of Minnesota, we don't want to be known for that. And as a native Chicagoan, I come from a long line of African American pastors, family members in the ministry who served and had a humongous heart for God and social justice. And I want to know, as a seminarian, we have a spiritual and a moral obligation to be that Christ-like presence in society. And I want to know, where do we go from here? And we really need your sage advice, Doctor.
Yeah, and and this is a shameless plug for my next project, but I really am writing on that, right? How to get the church engaged in grassroots work. I mean, I think there's a danger to the electoral cycle in the way that it captivates our imagination, right? So that our primary imagination for how to make change is through voting for different candidates. That's our number one option. And I'm not a don't vote kind of guy. That's not me. But I am we need to be out doing grassroots work, organizing, movement work, nonviolence in the communities, in our own neighborhoods. And I think that our imagination gets restricted, captivated by the cycle, that we lose sight of all the opportunities all year round that we could be doing, building power, organizing, strategizing, targeting things that are going on in our neighborhoods, right? Addressing, I know in our community, so we've been organizing around education funding in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's got one of the worst records because for the longest time we didn't even have a fair funding formula. So we had to fight for that. And then when they finally put in a fair funding formula, after seeing the extreme disparities in terms of funding, in terms of the whiter a school district, the more likely that they were getting overfunded. The more people of color in a school district, the more likely they were going to be underfunded, right? So we finally get the fair funding formula. What do? They increase the budget by 8%. They put the 8% through the fair funding formula and leave the rest the same, right? So now we have to fight to get all the money put through the fair funding formula. My city, Harrisburg, a small city, we would get $30 million a year more if it was all going through the fair funding formula. Think about the cumulative impact, right? So, but what are we doing? We got to organize, right? We got to get together, and the church has to be present in the neighborhood, in the community. And so what ends up happening is if we wait for the electoral cycle, then the electoral cycle determines the issues for us. But when you organize, you determine the issues, and then you prophetically speak back to the powers that be, right? It's the other direction. We're letting the tail wag the dog in our scenario, right? And so I think that we've got a different imagination for the power that we could express, a different kind of power, not a top-down power, but returning the power dispersed to the communities, a prophetic power, right, that speaks back to the powers and confronts them and speaks truth. And so we can build power on the local level in a different kind of way. And I think churches are primed and ready for that. That's the easy starting points, right? And so I think that is something that I think absolutely needs to be done as one of the ways that we could start with that. I mean, there's other things that we can be thinking through as well. But I do think that when we think about these local issues, waiting for the right candidate to show up is not going to be the way that we're going to get these issues solved. The reality is, in fact, sometimes I think that what makes a good candidate or not is not the one who has the same platform than you. It's the one that's going to be responsive when people speak and challenge it, right? Like that's the ideal if you're actually going to organize. If you're just going to sit around on your couch, then I guess you just need somebody that hopefully will align as much as possible to you. But really, the organizing dream is that you have somebody that's going to be responsive to the people.
Really appreciate this conversation, Drew. Thank you so much. You've just opened up so many things that we need to do as a seminary. But one of my questions has to do with freedom. Freedom for people of color in this country. People of color are not free in this country. Every day we tone down who we are, even to the point where we don't even know eventually who we are.
Yeah.
We are constricted and restricted by rage, if we try to assert ourselves, if we try to do something to attain our own freedom, and I think we should attain our freedom.
Yeah.
But could you talk more about how we could do that? Because the gospel of Jesus Christ is about freedom.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. You know, I'll speak out of my own personal experience of, I'd say, grappling with this, because in some ways it's one person to another, not fully free, talking about freedom, right? But I think, you know, for me, one of the things that has been meaningful, so I've bounced back and forth between, you know, raised in a black church in a black community, went to a, you know, majority white Christian college, and then have bounced in some ways back and forth in these spaces from since then, right? That's just been my life. And when I left my first, so right after I graduated, I was a youth pastor at a multiracial church. And when I left, I was beaten up. I was done. I was just like, you know, that multiracial spaces are not always what they promise to be, right? Because oftentimes white supremacy is not being named because they think that just because you have different bodies in a space, you think that they've overcome, right? And so it was a really rough time for me, especially I was young at that time, early 20s, and trying to make sense of who I was, trying to come to know who I was, and it was rough. And so I ended up, after that, going back home, and I was actually an associate pastor at my home church. In some ways, it was interesting because my home church, I mean, I had grown, I had changed. You know, theologically, I wasn't exactly where my home church was on everything. Oh, there we go. Theologically, I wasn't necessarily where my home church was on everything, but there was something really healing that took place in that space, because this was a space that always loved me and affirmed me and were proud of me, you know? And it began to help me realize how important it is to be a part of a community where you give, receive, and share love. I mean, to really, truly be loved and affirmed, right? And the fact of the matter is that oftentimes, at least in terms of working in white institutions and stuff like that, that's not what I'm receiving, right? And so I've known that to be my full self, I need these other spaces, these other communities that affirm who I am, that believe in me, that build me up. You know, I remember growing, I still am amazed sometimes to think about in my church, just the way they knew to speak into us as young folks, right? You are fearfully and wonderfully made, right? You're a child of God, right? Affirming us, building up our confidence in the midst of knowing that they're sending us out into a world that we're gonna deny those realities. And so re-entering into that space, it was a really healing space, even though theologically I had some differences, and they were okay with that, right? They were okay with, Drew's just a little weird now, right? But they affirmed me as a human being and my giftedness, and they loved on me, and they celebrated. And so I was able to be more fully myself because of them, because of my community, right? And so I think that part of the journey for us is we've got to have these spaces, these communities, the bubbling up of beloved community that we're actually experiencing, where people are actually loving on us and we are also loving on them, right? Giving, receiving, sharing love has to be a part of that path. And if that means that we know when we got to create that space and dip, right, into our own little enclaves of community, then we've got to do that so that we can experience. It helps free us and heal us to be more who we are called to be. That's my take, right? I don't have any other really grand answers, right? There's probably other folks with some others, but I know for me that sometimes that kind of love, that genuine, people caring about my well-being is some of the most liberative experiences in my own life. That carries on, it stays with you for a while, right? It doesn't just fade away the moment you leave. And so I think that's really important for all people of color to have those experiences in their lives, especially the more that we interface with, white supremacist contexts.
Dr. Hart, thank you for your words. My name is Hans, MDiv student. I am both inspired and confronted by your stories, and one for which I was particularly moved was the story of the living room and being invited in and be made at home, make myself at home. And then I'm thinking about this image for us who are training to be pastors too, to come back to that story and that challenge to think about how we might put on our blue jeans, so to speak, to radically consider how we're reshaping the way we worship and what the space, that living room in which we live right now is or might be. And I'm curious if you have thoughts about that, to flesh that out a little bit. And I think you got into a little bit some other stories, but also if you've seen some contexts that have been faithfully grappling with this, and some stories of hope in the midst of that sort of image of shifting what our living room looks like.
Yeah. I'm always hesitant to give suggestions on what that looks like, because in some ways, some of the actual work is in working that out. There are certainly, steps that can help people get along the way, but in some ways, that's less important than a church grappling with their story, right? And so I would say let the church grapple with who they are. Let them wrestle with how did they become white. Let them wrestle with what does it mean for their church to be located in that particular neighbor, and what's the story of race of the place in which they're situated, right? And pursue submitting and learning from others, right? Becoming students rather than teachers, right? I think that those postures, or maybe the starting point, are more important than probably some suggestions that I could give that at least would be probably more surface stuff. But I think those harder things will lead to that other stuff as well, if people are open to that kind of transformation. The second question, though, was, Stories of hope. I couldn't hear that, what? Stories of hope. Oh, stories of hope, yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to give a counterintuitive answer to that. In fact, I'll use my story that I give in Trouble I've Seen. I tell a story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And I intentionally tell Bonhoeffer's story because in some ways, it's not really about Bonhoeffer. It is about Bonhoeffer, but it's not about Bonhoeffer. It's about this black church that he experiences, right? It's about Abyssinian Baptist Church, right? So Bonhoeffer goes to New York, studies at Union Theological Seminary, makes his black friend, right? Bonhoeffer's got a black friend, right? But Bonhoeffer doesn't just remain with a black friend. His black friend, Frank Fisher, invites him into Harlem to Abyssinian Baptist Church to worship. And Bonhoeffer goes, and he goes again, and he joins and he participates in the life of this church. Bonhoeffer is blown away by what he sees. He's captivated by the preaching and the worship, the significance of Adam Clayton Powell's preaching on Jesus. All of this is consuming him. He's being changed. He's invited to participate. He's teaching Sunday school. There's belief that he at least preached once. Abyssinian Baptist, historic Black Baptist church. He's invited in. 1930, heart of Jim Crow segregation. This is not possible anywhere else but in the black church. So if we want a hopeful example of church in the United States, I'm not going to point to white church. I'm not even going to point to what we call the multiracial church movements. I'm going to say that there's always been the possibility for this inclusive church to exist, except for the fact that white people opt out of that. Never saw that as an option. But there's so much to learn from the history of the black church that has never, I often tell my students, I say, there's a difference between segregationist impulses and withdrawal. The white church was created out of segregationist impulses. The black church withdrew from that. It was a protest against white supremacist Christianity. So at its best, it has and always was this alternate option. And so there's something that all churches, I think, can learn from black churches, even as there's an irony to the fact that, you have these churches that are African this and African that are being created, right? And so the particularity of who they are is being centralized, and it's precisely in the particularity that there's also this opening and inclusiveness that's available. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that all churches work that out perfectly and all, but there's something to be learned, something hopeful. It's a hopeful story about the possibilities of the church, even on the underside, especially on the underside of white supremacy, that I think we can all learn from. That said, I will also say it's really important for white folk to learn and study the stories of white folk that have done well, right? I think white people need more good white people role models, right? And so I think that's some work. That's not my work to do, so that's some of y'all work, but to create some of those, who are the role models of people who opted out of performing whiteness, right? I think that that's important work to be doing as well, and that could be, I think, very encouraging and hopeful to have those stories alongside of, right, the black freedom struggle that existed, throughout the course of this history.
Got time for one more question.
Hi, I'm Bergen. I'm the one that's been taking pictures around campus newspaper. It's gonna be good. But I'm actually gonna go pull a full student here and not. But I really loved your last two chapters, especially. And the concluding pages, even most so, where you start to talk about the multi-ethnic church and the problems with that kind of movement. So I am ELCA Lutheran, and one of the things that's cited most, or one of the statistics cited most at both the national and local level, is that we're a 97% white denomination, oftentimes leading to the question of how do we change that demographic. Yeah. And so I'm curious as to whether I'm curious about your opinion on, is that the wrong question to be asking, and if so, do you have any guidance on what a better question would be for that denomination?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so my inclination, my first response is not for you to consider how to become a multiracial denomination per se. That obviously is a good thing, but that's not necessarily what I think first and foremost is, how do you break from white supremacy as a denomination, right? I think that's the more important question. Then, depending on the different contexts that you live in different churches, it's going to be embodied. If you've really broken from white supremacy, it's going to shape on the ground all different kind of things, right? But I think that's the bigger question. How do you make the break from white supremacy? How is the Lutheran Church still held captive to white supremacy, right? How is colonialism still entangled with the different Christian practices and beliefs of the Lutheran Church? I think those are the things that need to be grappled with.
All right, can we get a round of applause for our guest? Yeah, so we've got a few minutes before I think the next scheduled thing at 7:15, but we can just go ahead. There are refreshments and space to mill around and socialize up in the coffee shop area upstairs, so if you want to stick around and make your way up there. There are also books, Trouble I've Seen, available for purchase, you said? Check out, and if you brought your own, did you already do a book signing? I heard that. Okay, cool, yeah. I just want to know when I can get mine signed.